Cool. Hopefully everyone can see both of us and can see sort of the slide on our side. Thank you so much everyone for joining. Good morning. Today, we're starting our, webinar, well, the first webinar of our series, looking at giving yourself the best opportunity to reach the top. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mira and I head up our D&I team here at Harrison Holgate. In today's webinar, we are going to focus on unconscious bias and how to give yourself the right tools to navigate around this, especially when it comes to career development. So I'm joined today by Buki Masaku. For those of you who have not had the pleasure yet to meet Buki, he's a founder of multiple things, one of them being a results-orientated sales academy through which he has trained thousands of brokers globally. He's also the founder of Diversity Think Tank, which is a diversity and inclusion consultancy, and the author of I Don't Understand, which is a guide to this, which is based actually on a methodology that he's developed years of research. Now, before we just let you guys know that we will be holding a Q&A session at the end of the seminar. So do feel free to share any questions that you have in the Q&A box. It's just at the bottom of your screen. We do want you guys to contribute. We want this to be an interactive session and we really, really want to hear from you. So please do share your questions. There's also a comments box, which I can see a few of you have already started using, where you can share your thoughts throughout the conversation. For those of you who are joining us through the YouTube live link, you can also get involved by sharing your questions or comments with us by tweeting us using @HarrisonHolgate. So I'm super excited to get straight into this conversation with you, Buki. We've been speaking for a number of weeks, well, I think it's been months now. Yeah. We've been through some training sessions and we've had multiple conversations. And I know for a fact that our audience today are absolutely going to love your energy and your positivity on this topic. So before we start, how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm really good. I actually came off a session. You mentioned Rosa CAD, Results Oriented Sales yes. Academy, and in that capacity, I just came off a session which was focused around sort of getting meetings with target decision makers and so forth. So I'm kind of hype.
That's the best way to be. I'm super excited. Amazing. So, you've been a trainer now for almost 20 years. You've worked closely with thousands of insurance brokers across the globe. And now you also have a book based on research that you've put together on this topic. I'd really love to hear more about your journey and really what's brought you, to where we are today. So tell me a bit more.
Yeah, so look, I founded what is now called Rosa CAD, Results Oriented Sales Academy, around about, I guess, like coming into our 21st year. And that was primarily focused around training and development and consultancy from a sales perspective. And our clients were, the direction I went in terms of clients was in the financial world. And so my first clients were either insurance clients or investment fund management companies. And by accident, I started to have this kind of affinity to insurance companies, and fund management companies. And so over the years, I've worked with many of them throughout the world, focusing on increasing productivity and driving sales. And in the course of doing that, I met many professional services staff, salespeople, just people who are practitioners, for example, in insurance and in the investment world. And it was like anybody starting a business. It took time to build up my business. And through that, I had a lot of experiences. Prior to that, I was working for Sky and then Saatchi & Saatchi and then for a consultancy. And obviously I had some experiences there. And all of this culminated in a successful sales training practice. But then in the last sort of 3 years, I started to look at the whole diversity and inclusion arena. And for years, I'd been looking at unconscious bias and trying to understand it and kind of grappling with it, my experiences, my work experiences with it, and the impact it had on me. And I struggled, to be honest, with dealing with unconscious bias and trying to work it out. And it's funny because when I talk about I grappled with unconscious bias and direct and conscious bias as well, when I say that, most people think that I'm talking about it being towards me, but it was also actually me towards others, but I just didn't realize it, right? And so this kind of confusion and this introspection led to the creation of what is now called Diversity Think Tank. And yeah, our focus is diversity and inclusion, particularly around the unconscious bias and how to address it and equip people with the skills to navigate the inevitability of it.
I love that. And I can't wait to hear much more of that, during our session today. So as you've mentioned, diversity and inclusion is a topic of the time, with unconscious bias being something that's come up time and time again, when discussing how to create a more diverse and inclusive environment. It's something that we're going to be talking a lot about today as well. So, in your words, Vicky, how would you define unconscious bias?
Well, I think unconscious bias are negative societal conditioning that impacts behavior towards minorities. So it's career stifling behavior that is unconscious towards minorities and marginalized groups. And unchecked, it can have a really horrific negative impact on the careers of people who would otherwise have prosperous careers. So that's how I would describe it.
Amazing. So, I'm really, you've touched on it just then, I'm really interested in how unconscious bias has an impact on career development, particularly for those who do come from a minority group. The reality is that people might feel they're not chosen for a promotion for lots of different reasons. And without direct business related feedback in some situations, it's very possible to think that reasons of gender, maybe ethnicity, or a disability, physical or hidden, could have played a part for the unsuccessful applicant. So before, we do go through this in more detail, I did want to, run a quick poll, with our audience today so that I can get an idea of why, they don't think the issue of receiving proper feedback or guidance gets addressed in the office. So I'm just gonna, set that poll up now. I'll give you guys sort of 60 seconds, a minute, to really talk about the reason. So, for you guys, what is the number one reason for not calling out unconscious bias? And then Vicky, it'll be great to talk to you about the results that come off the back of it. So
sure.
Hopefully you can all see the poll question come through. Yeah, we're starting to get some answers.
Great, this is exciting.
Oh, they're flying in now. Okay, it's looking interesting.
Yeah, I'm thinking, should I vote as well?
Go for it.
It's not allowing me.
I'll give it sort of another 10 seconds. So there's just a few more people left to vote.
Don't be shy, give it a try.
Yes.
Vote.
Cool, I'm just going to stop it there.
Right.
And share the results because it's quite interesting.
Wow.
So we've got, there's quite a mix here, but it seems like there's two big points that are sort of coming out as the main reasons. So, the first being not knowing how the other person will react, and the second being not knowing how to call it out, which are really interesting. But it seems like there's quite a mix here. There's loads of reasons why it might be the case. So, what are your thoughts on these results, Vicky?
Yeah, I think it really is interesting. And then, those two, not knowing how the other person will react and not knowing how to call it out, are really telling in terms of how people think about unconscious bias and the fact that they recognize it. It's obviously something
Yeah.
that they've obviously had to deal with at some point, or know someone who's had to deal with it. But I mean, can I give my answer? What I would do?
Yeah, I would love to hear your answer.
Yeah, what I would really love to hear, actually, because I would go with none of the above, and I can see like 8% of the people said none of the above. I would love to know what their if they're saying none of the above, like I am, what their answer would be. But I'll tell you why I say none of the above. I think all of the answers are correct in different ways. But I think when you encapsulate all of them, what you come up with is something that I describe as defensive fragility. And it's the fear of defensive fragility, which I think is the #1 reason for people not calling out bias. And that includes not knowing how to, not knowing how the other person's going to respond, and so on. Yeah. So I guess the question is, what is defensive fragility?
Yes, yeah, that is the question.
Yeah, yeah. Should I answer? I tell you what it is?
Please do, please do. We're trying to hear.
Yeah. So defensive fragility is the feeling that people have when accused of something which goes against everything they stand for, the values that they've been brought up to. Brought up to have. And if you accuse somebody of something or intimate that to somebody that they're exhibiting certain traits which go against everything they stand for, it makes them defensive. This is human nature. It makes them defensive, and as a result of that, they get very defensive with the people that they're dealing with. And there's things like there's defensive fragility on a personal level, and there's corporate defensive fragility, where people don't want to address or don't want to, or feel horrible when they're accused or someone says to them that they're doing things which go against everything they stand for. And of course, with unconscious bias, the thing ultimately what it is discrimination, and discrimination is one of the strongest negative emotions that somebody can have. To be accused of it, it's the most, it creates a lot of defensiveness. Yeah,
no, I completely agree. So I guess, the question is, how would you call out this bias if you did find yourself in this position? And like you said, you don't want to create that defensive fragility. So how would you go about calling out bias without alienating yourself or creating an atmosphere with your boss?
Well, look, I think that's a really good question. And it's the bigger, it's challenging. It's difficult if you don't have a way. And to date, I don't think people do have a way. And before I answer that question, I just want to make reference to why I think that. I think in terms of addressing unconscious bias, most organizations come from a place of guilt, right? So they feel that because of things that have happened in the past and structural isms, that there is a degree of guilt that they have to carry the show. They have to carry. And so as a result of that guilt impairs their vision to the actual, the totality of the problem, right? And so the emphasis is on equipping senior management or managers with skills to interrupt their cognitive shortcuts, which lead to them making decisions based on unconscious bias. And I think that's incorrect, right? I think that's incorrect. And because their vision is impaired by this guilt, what it means is that not enough attention is allocated to equipping the other side of the equation with skills to deal with unconscious bias. So in terms of calling out unconscious bias, you need to have an approach. And our IDU methodology is all about that. It's all about how to call out unconscious bias. And the way to call out unconscious bias, or the way that I describe in my book and my methodology, is to come from a place of dispassionate developmental inquiry. That is, you want to look, when you sense bias, it's always sensed. You never 100% know if the person is actually coming from a place of bias. And this is where I fell down a lot of the time. I would think people were being biased towards me. But actually, the reality was that thought made me biased towards them, right? And we call that reverse bias. So if you recognize those 2 points, then you need to find a way of how can I determine whether I'm actually on the receiving end of unconscious bias, and if I am, call it out. And ironically, using dispassionate developmental inquiry, the bias calls itself out. So then the question then becomes, well, what is dispassionate developmental inquiry and how do you call it out? And the simple way to call it out is to use these 3 words. I don't understand. I don't understand. And if you turn it into a question, that is adequate, it's a statement. But if you add a question on it and say, I don't understand, it invokes the teacher in the other person. It invokes the coach in the other person. So the person then will naturally rise to explaining to you what the issue is. They'll rise, and typically it's somebody in a more senior role or higher influence. So what they're going to do is jump into their natural role and coach you and explain to you. So they'll say why I made this decision or why we didn't choose you. And then now you're into a conversation which otherwise would be very difficult to get into. Once you're into that conversation, right, you can then ask them questions based on what they're saying. And suddenly what happens is you start to illuminate the bias. If there is actual bias, it just calls itself out. Or you realize that actually you were the wrong candidate, or you just weren't good enough. Or you realize that there's something that you weren't privy to, which led to the decision. Or you realize that there's something that neither of you actually knew, which led to the decision. But you're never going to get there unless you call it out. So you have to call it out, but the question is how. And the way to call it out is to simply say, I don't understand. Now, there are different ways of saying that, and I go through that in my book and in our training, but essentially it's coming from a place of dispassionate developmental inquiry.
Amazing. Right? That makes so much sense. Taking the emotion out of it, it's going to help with the defensive fragility. So that completely makes sense. So I guess we've established now that unconscious bias is natural. And like you mentioned, there can be bias and also reverse bias. And that lots of what is happening, it's not conscious discrimination. And we do find ourselves, in a case that in busy office environments, individuals do need to be able to articulate their qualities and attributes very clearly and objectively. So that's amazing. Now, before I kind of ask you the next question, I just wanted to sort of share some stats with you all. They're all stats that really surprised me and really just showed me, why this topic is so important. So these stats have come from various different sources, but kind of paint a real, picture of what it's like out there. So one of the reports that I came across suggested that for the first time in 6 years, there's been 0 Black CEOs, CFOs, or chairs in the FTSE 100 index, which is such a shocking number. And then on top of that, in 2020, so last year, only 5% of FTSE 100 CEOs are women, which is even less in the FTSE 250, which is only 2%. And then there's still 49% of FTSE 100 companies which lack any BAME representation at board level. And I kind of dug a bit deeper to try and find diversity stats for other minority groups, looking at things like disability and neurodiversity, and I couldn't find anything that gave us an idea of senior representation across these groups, which pretty much tells me that either it doesn't exist or hasn't even been looked at, which is really interesting when you look at actually how many positive stats there are out there on, having diverse workforces. So, there's this report by Centre for Talent and Innovation, which suggested that diverse workforces have 19% better employee retention, 42% greater team commitment, and 57% better team collaboration. So when you look at these numbers, it pretty much seems like a no-brainer. So what are your thoughts on these stats, Bucky?
Yeah, I think they're very telling about the situation. And I think, what we have to say, look, it's very important for us to say, look, this is a very inclusive society. The UK is extremely inclusive. However, one of the things that we pride ourselves on is that we hold ourselves accountable to a high standard, right? And I think by our standards, those figures could be a lot better. And I think the way that we sometimes, there are many different reasons for those numbers and those stats Many different reasons for those stats, and you'd ask yourself, well, given the advantages of having a more diverse workforce that you've just outlined, why are we in this situation? And I think it's a two-way thing. It's not just, usually the way that we look at this is that we say, okay, we need to change things structurally to allow for greater opportunities for more diverse teams and more diverse people at senior level. But I also think, I come back to what I was saying earlier, we need to equip the diverse people, the minorities and the marginalized groups with skills to be a greater player in that process. At the moment, it's just one part, the majority, whoever that majority might be, right? Taking on board the whole issue. And I think it's a collaborative issue. There's joint complicity in unconscious bias, right? And I think if you look, for example, on the 0 Black CEOs in the FTSE 100, right? I actually did a talk on this in response to CNN report, right? I actually did a talk on this. It's not just about looking for people different. And even doing that is kind of tokenism, right? If you think about it, if you're good enough, right, you can't just make anybody a CEO of a FTSE 100 company. That's ridiculous, right? The person has to be good enough to rise to the attention of the boards that pick these people, right? So that's the first thing. But I think the problem is that there's not equal opportunity in rising to that position. Right? Yeah. And I think one of the things is, yes, hire more diverse people, etc. But I also think you have to equip them to deal with the inevitability of the bias that they will receive in their career. And the problem is, if we just take that example of the Black CEOs, the problem is that people aren't equipped to deal with bias, and they will receive bias. So if you start as a graduate in a company and you're on the receiving end of some kind of bias which is related to where you come from or your ethnic background, or you're a woman, for example, if you don't know how to deal with it, if you're one of the few that eventually get to a senior management position that potentially could lead you eventually to being a CEO, you're going to have this negative view of your opportunity, right? You're going to think, well, there's no point, there's a club, there's a boys' club, or this type of club, and I'm never going to get in. They don't talk, they don't really look for people like us, and we don't seem to, have the kind of relationship that's conducive to them moving us on. But the reason why a lot of the time you don't have that relationship, or you don't get on, or you're not seen as the person that can be in the boys' club or the club, right? Is because over time you've never been able to navigate the inevitability of the bias that you receive. And I think we have to equip people with those skills. And part of those skills, like I was mentioning before, right, is one is dealing with what I describe as directional bias. That's bias towards you, but also recognizing that there's reverse bias, right? Reverse bias is where you are conditioned about the majority. It's usually white, male, middle-class, heterosexual people. We have a conditioned view of people that fall into that category, right? And that affects our perception of decisions that they make. So anytime they make an unfavorable decision, let me speak about me. They make an unfavorable decision towards me, I assume that they're coming from a place of bias, right? Now, they pick up my assumption. I may not say it, but they can feel it, right? So now here's the problem. They get irritated by that, but they won't tell me, right? I get irritated by what I presume, right? Or I assume is their bias, but I won't tell them. What I do is I look for people who look like me, right? And I tell them. That reinforces the bias about the majority. What they do is look for people who look like them and tell them. And that reinforces the bias around the minority having a chip on their shoulder. And never the twain shall meet. So it's a self-perpetuating problem. And when you have this problem in an organization, if you use that FTSE 100 example, it basically means, if we use that example of 0 Black CEOs, when confronted with this bias, what they perceive to be bias, right? They don't know how to deal with it, and it stops them from progressing. And likewise, when a manager who is highly likely to be a white, middle-class, heterosexual male, right? is confronted by their reverse bias, that they just get irritated. Why is these guys so uncomfortable? Why is their disposition in this way? And so on. And so how's that going to get you into the club? I'm not going to let somebody into the club who I'm not comfortable with. It's as simple as that. But nobody wants to say that, because they feel that if they say that, people will assume that they're not sympathetic to the equality cause. A more direct way of saying that is they'll think that they're racist. It's not that they're racist. The point is that they're just uncomfortable with those people at that level at that time. I'm not saying this is everyone. I'm just giving this as an example. So I think what we need to do is equip people with the skills. It's a skill. It's an interpersonal skill. It's not the only reason. There's many other reasons, but I think it's a big reason. And let's face it, Mira, what do people say when they talk about unconscious bias? What do they say more often than not? What do they say? I didn't get this role. This person did this happened to me just because of this. I can't. They never promote people like this. This happens. That happens. That's it. So it's a very big part of this problem. And until we start addressing it and stop saying that there's one guilty party, right, and there's this other hapless victim, right? Until we stop doing that, the guilty will always feel guilty, and the hapless victim will always be a hapless victim. I've got an analogy for you. I'm conscious of time, but I really want to give it to you because I think I think it speaks to this issue, right? So I've got this analogy. We've all heard about the parents, right, who because of bad times, who fell on hard times and suddenly are now in good, are now doing really well, and they've got kids, and they want to make up for not being able to give their kids the kind of lifestyle they would have liked to have given them, right? So what happens? They start showering the kids with presents, right? And then the kids start liking all the presents, right? And so they get used to the presents, right? And the parents have to keep giving them more and more expensive ones and more different ones. And then what happens, right? Human nature kicks in. The parents get tired of giving these kids all these expensive presents, right? So they resent doing that. Now the kids feel resented. They feel resented because they're no longer getting the presents, right? And so what happens is that the situation that they were trying to solve starts all over again. Now, this is because the parents came from a place of guilt. Because whenever you come from a place of guilt, it always ends in tears. And when they came from a place of guilt, it impaired their vision to what the actual problem was. Now, what the actual problem was they wanted to spend more time. Their kids wanted more love. So if you just given them more love, spent more time with them, it would have cost you a lot less, and everybody would be happy. But you couldn't see that because you came from a place of guilt, which impaired your vision. And of course, the kids, in relation to how they see their parents, they come from a place of annoyance and not getting what they want and not having love, which they saw as coming from the presents, right? So they have their own impaired vision. So the key is to recognize that this guilty, what I call a guilty perpetrator, hapless victim model, impairs vision. What we need to do is come from a place of fairness, a place of equity. And if we come from a place of fairness and equity in relation to addressing unconscious bias, we're going to equip everybody with the skills to deal with it, right? And then we can move on, and you can give us consultants something else to do. Not before you come and give us the business. Does that make sense? I was being on my soapbox there, but I'm very passionate about this.
No, that makes complete sense. I think that was, I could have explained it any better myself. So, that was great. Thanks for that, Bookie. Yeah. I guess, we've talked about those stats, and one of the challenges we probably have is that there isn't enough role models at that senior leadership level.
Yes.
Which could be one of the barriers to people being able to develop their careers and get themselves to the top. So what advice would you have for companies to be able to encourage and support allies, particularly at the moment, where the world is changing, a lot of us are working from home, how can we create, allies in the virtual world? And I guess, how does that differ from an in-person workplace?
Yeah, that's another big question. I think there's a lot of things that we can do. I think, without going back to what I was saying before, I think the people that are in the business at the moment, right, I think we have to create an environment conducive to them rising. And one of those is one of the things is equipping them with the wherewithal to deal with bias so that they can rise. And if they can rise, then naturally you will have people in an organization who look different, who are diverse, that can be role models. So I think that's really important. But I think also the few people or that are in senior management roles, executive positions, need to step up. And I think a lot do. But I mean, I think the more structured we can be about doing that, I think the more likelihood we can create genuine role models that people can look up to. I don't think it's just about doing diversity and inclusion initiatives. I think it's about having people who are in those roles come forward and collaboratively come up with a way in which they can encourage more and more people to go for the roles. Because let's look, there are some people. This is a sad state of affairs in some cases, and when you look at it from this perspective. But there are some people that are just glad to be at the party. They're just glad to get the role. So I'm at top 10 insurance company. I've died and gone to heaven. They think that that's it. That's the best that they can do, because directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously, something or somebody has told them that. So we need somebody telling them the opposite. And I think the more structured way that we can do that, I think the better. And I think recruiters have a big role to play in that, because recruiters are placing senior people from, be they women, be they ethnic minorities, be they disabled people. I think recruiters have a role in that, and they can be structured about the way that they encourage role models and allies.
Yeah, definitely. So, we've been establishing a sensation or feeling that unconscious bias does go both ways. And, like you said, it can perpetuate a cycle or build up of frustration in a work setting. And without doing anything to address the situation, it's so easy to imagine how this can build and build and build. So much so that, it might cause someone to leave their job and move jobs, or even worse, it might, get someone to snap, which kind of reminds me of one of the situations that you mentioned to me quite early on, the Coffeegate scenario, which maybe you can share with the audience today. So really, the next topic I really want to talk about is microaggression. And I also want to run another poll, the Peeve or Leave poll, which I'll let you introduce. But before we do sort of move on to the poll, in your words, what is microaggression, and how can we navigate around this in the workplace?
So microaggressions are kind of subtle, unconscious, is subtle career stifling behavior, which is unconscious, which can have a negative effect on people of marginalized groups and minorities. That's essentially what it is. So these are comments or behaviors that people exhibit that are born out from unconscious bias, and they have a dramatic impact. That over time, the accumulation of these comments, behaviors, more comments and behaviors create tension, racial tension, sexual orientation tension, different types of minority tensions within the workplace. And, this can cause people to flip out via displaced anger at a later date. And it can stifle careers. It stops people from being themselves and being confident. So that's how I describe microaggressions. Career stifling behavior and comments that are unconscious and driven by unconscious negative societal conditioning.
Yeah, and do you just want to sort of tell us about the Peeve or Leave poll before I run it?
Yeah, so the Peeve or Leave poll is this, right? So what you have to do as well is you have to recognize that every time, it goes back to every time you've perceived that somebody's coming from a place of bias, even with a microaggression, you're never 100% sure. And also, we can't keep every day trying to fight something which is going to happen in one way or another at some point. So you are going to get unconscious, but you are going to get microaggressions. towards you from time to time. And you have to make a decision in the moment to say, am I going to give energy to this, or am I going to let it go, right? So peeve or leave is all about that. Peeve or leave is all about, am I going to get peeved by this, or am I going to leave it, but maybe say something subtle to recondition the person? If you're peeved, that means you're really upset. You're going to have an expansive discussion about it. If you leave, you maybe make a small comment and move on, and don't let it spoil your lunch.
Cool. Okay, I think that's a great way of explaining it. So I'm just launching the poll now. There are a few, different statements here, so do scroll down to vote. But if you guys can, vote whether you're peeved by the statement or, you'd leave, that'd be amazing. And then we can run through the answers with you again, Becky, the results.
Cool.
Can everyone see that poll?
Well, I can. Are we voting? Are people voting?
Yeah, we're starting to get the votes coming in. Okay, we're getting there. They're coming in now. There's some interesting results here, actually.
Yeah. Just looking at some of the comments from earlier, actually, there's quite a few I didn't realize.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, there's been quite a few comments that's come in.
Wow. How fast people type. Wow.
All right, I'll let some of the last people bring in their votes, and then we'll share the results. Okay, I'm just going to end it and share them now. There you go. Can you see those, Bookie?
Yeah, yeah.
It's been quite a split here. So, yeah. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm just going through this. You speak so well. Leave, yeah, leave that. Yeah, you know. Sometimes I would be confronted by people saying to me, "Oh, you speak so well." I remember this, right? And I would think, I had two ways of dealing with that. The simple way to deal with it, or sorry, I'll tell you the hard way of dealing with it, is saying, "Oh, well, we're both in client-facing roles. Why do you think I speak so well? What a ridiculous thing today. What are you trying to say?" That would be the internal negativity in my mind. But could it be that the person actually just thought I spoke so well? I mean, they could, right? So instead of getting annoyed about it, why not just say, "Oh, thanks, you speak so well too." That's it. Yeah?
Yeah.
So how did you get the job, Peeve? Where are you from? Leave. I'm with the leave. Where's my wallet? Leave. Well, that's not, I wouldn't leave that. I would never leave that. I think I've had that said to me, and I have left it. But in retrospect, I shouldn't have left it, because it's as a Black person, it speaks to the most heinous and horrible negative societal conditioning in relation to Black people. So frankly, I would not leave that. So I'm surprised that so many people said leave it. You're a bit of a dark horse. Yeah, I'd probably leave that, because it just could mean, it could mean the genuine meaning that, yeah. But sometimes some people say that when it's because they're different that people are saying that they're a bit of a dark horse. So it's not the color thing. It's more that because they're different, they're perceived as being a dark horse. Stop being hysterical. That would peeve me, and that's typically aimed at women, and that's a really bad one. I don't know if me recognizing that makes me a male chauvinist, but
it peeved me, yeah.
All right, okay. Yeah. Can I touch your hair? That would peeve me. Again, ones like this, I might leave them. So a person says, "Can I touch your hair?" Right? I personally would say, "Well, yeah, sure. Can I touch yours first?" And then the person would think, "Oh my God, what do you mean?" And suddenly, you've reconditioned the person, you can move on, and your lunch is great. The problem with these things, they spoil your lunch. If you start, If you get too emotionally involved with it, it ruins your lunch. Then the whole day goes awful. Right, your lot, or your people, or aren't. Yeah, I think that would peeve me. Why are you getting so angry? Right? Yeah, in this context, yeah, that would peeve me too. So I'm kind of in agreement. Some of them I would leave, you know. Some of them have shocked me. The "where's my wallet" or "where's your wallet" thing, I think is that would really peeve me. So, and I thought that would be obvious to everyone. So that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, some interesting results there.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's really interesting. So I guess, you know, my question to you is, just say you're on the flip side of this situation where you're the manager or the colleague that's been called out for microaggression.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Well, look, here's the thing. You know, if you've been, it depends how you're called out. To date, I think the way people call out microaggressions, it's probably not the most effective way in most cases, right? I don't want to keep going on about my IDU methodology, but we teach people a way of calling it out, which doesn't invoke defensive fragility. If you are on the receiving end of being called out, I mean, hopefully it's done in the right way. But I mean, yeah. If it's not done in the right way, I think you have to accept it. I think, you know, you have to hear what the other person says. But this is why I think it's important to equip people with the skill to call it out. And also, we have to equip the manager, to your point, if it's a manager, with the skill of calling out the other person if they're coming from a place of reverse bias. They need to have that. There's a skill. In a sense, they need to say, "I don't understand." In a sense, they need to say, "I don't understand," right? And get the person to elaborate. But I think we do have to call it out, and we have to call each other out until we dissipate bias as a problem. And I think having the skills to do that will enable you to do it. But yeah, I think people need to be open to developmental, what I call open to developmental inquiry, but open to being called out, I guess, you know.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Does that kind of explain it, answer it? My thing is, I just think that people don't have these skills. You know, a lot of people will say things, you know, the problem is I don't want the manager to be a victim, and I don't want the victim to be a victim, right? But if you accuse me of some kind of microaggression, I need to be understanding of your perspective. But at the same time, I don't want to spend the rest of my day feeling how bad I was, right? And I think we need to teach people how to call it out in a way that doesn't make you feel bad. And we need to teach people how to call the other person out if they've got it wrong. But with biases, I mean, I think with microaggressions, I think it's pretty clear. So call it out and let them deal with it.
No, that completely makes sense. And I just want to kind of go through one more question before we do move on to Q&A, because this is something that I've found quite interesting, and I've not really been sure how to sort of handle the conversation. So we recently ran a survey to get a better understanding of diversity and inclusion gaps and challenges specifically in the insurance market. Now, something that came up a few times in the comment section, but is also something that I've come across through conversations in the market, is the feeling of positive discrimination against the majority group. So I really wanted to hear your thoughts on this. What if someone from the majority group feels like they're being discriminated against? Is this some kind of bias fatigue? What are your views on it?
Yeah, I think there is bias fatigue, and I think it's real. You know, you can't turn a page without seeing some kind of talk of unconscious bias. Guess what? We're talking about it now, right? So I understand that people have a degree of bias, a degree of fatigue in relation to bias. And I just in brackets, isn't it? I find it kind of sad that we say words like majority and minority. You know, I think it's sad because it makes out, because I think when we do that, we're actually we're getting off with what I describe as the enemy of progress, right? Do you know what the enemy of progress is?
No.
No, the enemy of progress is polarization. It's this idea that there's two types of people, and that this problem is, is down to one person or down to another type of person. There's no us and them. There's just we, and we need to have a collaborative approach to addressing this. I think that's a very important point to make. And every time we say the majority and the minority, we're just pushing people who are naturally together apart. So I think that's something that we need to look at. But in terms of bias fatigue, I think it's very real. But what people need to understand as managers and so forth is that, we live in a diverse world, right? And your team is diverse. It will be diverse, and it will get more diverse. And so this is just as important as any other coaching development issue. And so when you do feel bias fatigue, I think you should recognize it. It's okay. It's okay to feel that. But then ask yourself, why do I feel that? And why is there so much talk about bias, unconscious bias? And once you answer those questions, hopefully you'll come to the conclusion that, all of my teams are diverse. So this is a key. If I want my team to operate productively in a profitable, effective manner, I need to be cognizant of the issues around bias. So I can't get fatigued by it. I'm fatigued by it because nobody ever talked about it properly, as openly as we're talking about it, till probably the last 5 years, right? Yeah. And so that's why I'm fatigued. But the reality is, this is just as important as time management. It's probably more. Sorry, it's more important than time management. Yeah. It's just as important as any other major issue around operating productive teams. So that's my response to bias fatigue. Just call it out. The other thing I would say is, when you feel that you're on the end of discriminatory behavior from minorities, you have to call it out. The problem is how to call it out. And to date, nobody's shown that. But the good news is we have a way of doing that, which, I'd encourage you to look into.
Amazing. So I'm just conscious of time, and I want to make sure we can answer some of the questions. So I'm just going to move into sort of the Q&A piece. Before I do that, did you have any closing comments, Bookie?
Well, I think that's a really good. No, I think if we can disengage from embracing the enemy of progress, polarization, and look at this problem as a joint problem, there's joint complicity for this issue. And when we look at it from that perspective, we're more likely to allocate more attention to equipping people to deal with it, as opposed to I'm going to say one side or one party coming from a place of guilt to address it, which just leaves other people as victims that you're trying to change from that.
Yeah, no, that's been amazing. So I'm just having a look at the questions. I've got one here from you, from Paula. So Paula has asked, so it's been well publicised that many government departments have called a halt to their unconscious bias training as they didn't think it had much effect. What do you think they were doing wrong in this case?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think, well, first of all, you don't just write off something because it didn't work for you. So I think the first thing is that they bought the wrong training. Frankly, that's what I think. That's the first thing. The second thing is that they come from this guilty. When addressing unconscious bias, 98% of every organization, right, be it not-for-profit, actual organization, government, they all come from a guilty perpetrator, hapless victim model. That is, there's one guilty party, and you've got these hapless victims. And the only way we can help these poor put upon minorities is to change the way that we think and change the way that we behave. Well, if you do that, you will always be guilty and they will always be a victim, right? And when you are constantly whipping yourself for things that you've done wrong, or things that your forefathers have done wrong, eventually that leads to resentment. And that resentment is voiced, in this case with the government, in a way by saying the whole unconscious bias subject is nonsense. No, you don't understand how to address it. You keep coming from guilty perpetrator, hapless victim model, and that's why you naturally get upset about it. So there you go. That's my answer. That's what I think they did wrong. They should have come from it from a place of equity and fairness, not blaming themselves, just equipping everybody with the skills to deal with it, as opposed to them, the middle class, white majority, changing the way that they think. It's a joint issue. It's a joint complicity.
Yeah, I completely agree. Another really interesting question. Should we be careful with labeling behavior unconscious? Do we not think this takes accountability away from people with potentially dangerous views about marginalized people? Is it really unconscious if certain comments are aimed at specific groups only? Isn't this really a conscious decision?
Yeah, that's a really great question.
Yeah.
That's a really great question. And my editor for my book was always harping on about that to me as well. She was really wanting me to address it. And I think the good news is that conscious bias is very obvious. And if you're confronted with conscious bias, this is when you do go straight to HR. And you go to HR, you don't just say, oh, I've had this racist comment towards me, or I've had this certain type of behavior toward me. You make a formal complaint, written complaint, and you inform them that you're going to press charges, not you might, or you're thinking about it. You know, conscious bias is easy to recognize. So when you're on the receiving end of conscious bias, just take it to, give it the extreme response that it requires. So I don't think by dealing with an unconscious bias, you're letting people off the hook. Yeah,
no, I completely agree. I've just looked at the time, so unfortunately these are the only questions we can go through at the moment, but what I'm going to do is just share mine and Bookie's LinkedIn pages in the comments, the chat box. So please, feel free to reach out to either of us to continue this conversation. Any questions we've missed that you want to ask, either of us are more than happy to kind of continue that and cover that with you. I just wanted to sort of take this opportunity, Bookie, to thank you for being part of this conversation. I feel like I've taken a lot from this, and I'm hoping everybody else that's joined us today, from that first poll that we did, looking at reasons why people don't call out bias, to where we are now at the end of conversation. I hope you've taken away some tools and things with you that's going to help you, whether you're moving careers or, you're trying to create a more diverse workforce yourself. I also wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you so much for your questions, your comments. You've been amazing. Like I said, I'll share those LinkedIn profiles, and I'll also share a link so you can find out a little bit more about Bookie's book on IDU. We are going to be running another webinar as part of this series on the 10th of June, where we're going to be looking more closely at code switching in the workplace. So after this webinar, you will be getting some more information. So do register and join us so we can continue this conversation, looking at giving yourself the best opportunity to reach the top. Again, thanks again, Bookie. Your time has been invaluable. I'm really looking forward to, getting my hands on the book and for our next webinar session.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
No, it's been great. It's been amazing. That was perfect. That was a great conversation for me.
Yeah, great.
I'm just going to share those links now.
Are we still on? Are we still on live, or are we on?
Yeah, we are still on. I'm just sharing the links so that everyone can access those through the chat box. Oh. Right, that should have come through to you guys. Thank you, Alan, for joining.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate the questions. I just can't believe how many there are, actually, and the comments.
Yeah, so, and there's some amazing questions.
Yeah, and there was one, I've just had my eyes opened by one. Somebody, I don't know if people are listening, but somebody said that some of those comments in the PIVA leave could be applicable to anyone. And that's true, and that's so true. That's why you have to be careful how you decide how you deal with it. So yeah,
there's some really, really interesting comments as well. Yeah. I think this question of perceived reverse bias is another key reason why people don't call out bias.
Yeah, that's a big one. It's true. People don't. They don't want to be seen as unsympathetic to the equality cause, but they have to call it out. Otherwise, if you don't, you're part of the problem. It's just how do you call it out? That's the problem.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's amazing. Yeah, definitely some really interesting comments here. We can't control what other people do and say. We can only control our response or reaction, which is very true.
Yeah. Yeah, this is amazing. Should we not rush to perpetuate poor values and bad behaviors of some incumbent boards and senior management? Yeah, but that's my point. That's reverse. That's my point.
Yeah.
In an interview for them.
This is interesting. I find it hard to draw a line between unconscious bias and people simply don't like you. Any good suggestions?
No, but that could be an issue as well. People may not like you. I think, you know, using the it's a shame the person's probably gone, but using the IDU methodology, you can see if they just don't like you, or actually if it's genuine bias, or you can actually tell, you can discern that.
Yeah.
Gosh, there's so many comments I would have loved to answer. We just, the time is just an issue. Are you getting the YouTube ones as well?
Yes, I'm just waiting for those to, I had a few come in. I'll share them with you.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Well, thank you everyone again. I'm just going to end the conversation here. It's been amazing to have, you know, everyone that's left here. It's been amazing to have you. And like I said, our next one's on the 10th of June. So looking forward to seeing a lot of you there again to continue the conversation.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.